All right, I will go ahead and pop on the slides here. And then go to my slideshow. So I actually added 4 difficult times onto the title, because I feel like these are complicated times, and whether we're looking at how we're managing our work, our life, our work-life balance, our experience in the world, I just think there's so much complexity right now. So we just kind of have to acknowledge that. And I'm coming at this from my background, just super briefly. I'm a medical anthropologist, spent a lot of time doing research around health and healing in different cultures. I spent 2 years in a mindfulness teacher training program to make sure I could bring this kind of information to the general public. I've been studying trauma healing for about 9 months, and also I'm an integrative health coach through Duke, trained and certified. I try to pull all that. There's a lot. And I also am relying a lot of on internal family systems theory, which is a wonderful psychotherapy approach that I think pulls a lot of this stuff together. So just to say, I'm coming at this from a bunch of different lenses. I have resources and readings at the end of these slides. I can send the slides to Jackie and she can send them out, or however we want to get them out. So you have some additional resources, but that's a little bit about where I'm coming from with all of this. I thought it was funny as I was preparing my slides like 2 weeks ago. Apparently the CSU, the CSU Researcher magazine came out online for the first time. So I actually got to kind of open it up and dig around in it. And the theme was 2023 resilience. I thought that was fascinating. But what it pointed out to me was nothing new. Everything was about complexity in our culture, our climate crisis, the economy, fires, food safety, the difficult politics. There were articles about that in our CSU Researcher magazine, and I thought, oh boy, we're all framing up things in a similar way, but no one's offering us like, well, what do we do about all of this? Not how do we fix the social, political, economic problems, but how do we live within these wild times in a, rational, calm, productive way? And I really want to explore that. So when we look at kind of generic definitions of resilience, it talks about the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, significant sources of stress. Adapting well. And adaptation is just the process of change. Ecosystems have to go through the process of change. We don't think about our own ecosystem as how do we adapt internally to some of these traumas and tragedies. And this definition is all good and well. I mean, this concept of adaptation is important, but again, this definition leaves out the how. How do we adapt in the face of mounting crises? It's not really clear what it looks like. And what do we do when stressors are bearing down on us? And so just a hint of where this presentation is going is, as I mentioned early on, what to me adaptation about starts with reconnecting with our internal landscape and working with our internal landscape. We are so externally focused in our culture. It's what we need, what we have to do, where to go, who we're talking to. We are so disconnected with ourselves in many ways and from our inner world. I mean, how many of us sit quietly and just notice what we're feeling during the day? Like entire weeks or months could go by before we actually stop and pay attention. We don't necessarily know how to find safety and security and calm and compassion inside of ourselves. And hint that this really is the key to resilience. Our path towards resilience is not a path of finding more security on the outside, because it's just not going to happen. I hope that's clear. The last 3 years have shown us that for sure. But our path toward resilience is really a path inward, in finding the stable core of our own selves that actually exists. We actually have a stable core. And I'm going to really talk through that in the kind of second half of the presentation. So nothing new here, but just naming these sources of stress. It's not, we don't have to name politics or, the economy or fires and floods. We can say loss of control. We don't feel like we have a whole lot of it. The uncertainty of the future. What if we default? What economically is that going to mean for us? Just the overwhelm of media that we have it's in a lot of polls, they'll show that media overload is a top source of stress. We don't often name that. Conflict in our lives and our relationships and our workplaces and all of it. Conflict within ourselves, loss, at the same time of all these macro level things, we're dealing with family loss and community loss and global environmental loss and all of these things. And then of course there's illness. And heck, if we just want to drop all of that, just let's talk about our generalized anxiety, because that's plenty, just the anxiety we're all carrying around. Lots of sources of stress, important to name it, to not get caught in the loops of it and say, this is all my life is stress, but just to say there's a lot going on in it. But there are two sources of stress that I really want actually to spend a little bit more time on. And that's the lack of safety that we're feeling and the isolation. Because for me, this is coming up more and more. This is coming up with my family. I too have a child. He's in middle school, and dropping him off every day, having to think about, well, is he going to be safe? It's a real problem. Violence and gun violence accelerating at an alarming pace. There have been more mass shootings than there have been days in 2023, right? We know this. We are not talking about it, I don't think, in terms of how is this affecting our stress. And just to name the stress that is causing the violence. So violence is a reaction to something. People don't turn to violence when they're feeling well. So all those things I named in the last slide, eating away at us. And arguably, there's just a growing disconnect and isolation in our society in general. The sense of despair has its roots in many things. And we need to talk about the despair and the human pain and the social conditions that may be at the source of the pain. But the outcome is that we are now all struggling with a sense of safety. A sense of safety on the outside. So this is going to go back to my original point. We have to cultivate a sense of safety on the inside to feel well, because there are just some things we can't control on the outside. And to name isolation, COVID hit us really hard. We went from moving about freely and never even imagining what it could be like to be confined in our own houses and spaces. We learned a lot about isolation, and truthfully, the security we felt probably before COVID has diminished. We probably don't feel the same sense of security. And that has led to a sense of isolation. We may not be doing the kinds of things we used to do. Some of that may be good, but in all of the research, it shows that isolation has increased since COVID. And what we thought would bring us connection, social media, has actually done the opposite. We're more disconnected with each other than ever before. Our circles have narrowed. The number of people feeling lonely has grown. Almost half of Americans report feeling lonely, and the numbers are greatest among young people. So that all goes back into the lack of safety, all of it. Just to put it out there, what do we do about all of this? The challenge is we respond to stress in very specific ways. Whatever the sources of stress are in our lives, there are clear patterns that we use to respond to stress. Some of us may self-medicate or numb. That might be reaching for food or reaching for things that can just numb us out. Some people go to substances and alcohol. Others of us, or maybe we do all of these things, but we might be seeking distractions, ways that we don't have to feel the discomfort of all the things happening. We might isolate even more or disconnect. Some of us overwork and we just stay really, really, really busy. Some of us freeze and really underperform. But the point here is that we tend to turn away from our discomfort. Whatever those stressors are that are pushing at us, we tend to turn away from it. We don't want to look at it or feel it. And the behaviors we use to diminish our stress may unintentionally amplify our experience of stress. I say all of this not because we're bad people or we have bad habits, but because we remain largely unconscious about the habits and we do it again and again and again, even though we know this isn't helping, we know this isn't really soothing us. It may soothe us in the moment, but not in the long term. So how do we bring these habits to our consciousness? I want to just point out this relationship between our mind and our body. I think probably most of us inherently know this, but we were built with this thing called an amygdala in our brain. We evolved with this, and it stores our memory of fear. So we can get triggered when something stresses us out, when we feel concerned or not safe. That amygdala can send signals to our nervous system, and it can overwhelm our nervous system when we don't feel safe. And we do also have this part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that holds the memory of our safety. But when we get really stressed and overwhelmed, the communication between that frontal cortex and the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, it gets cut off. So we don't cycle through our basic coping strategies. We stay stuck in fight or flight, or we might stay stuck in freeze longer. And with trauma, which I won't go into too much, but I'm going to kind of make allusions to how trauma functions in our body, but unprocessed energy that gets stuck when we go through a traumatic experience, it really gets locked in our body. And so that fight flight reaction kind of keeps it locked in there. And the problem is that stress can be chronic. With all these things in our society, or chronic work stress or stress at home, or all of the above, just locks us into a state of overdrive. This is where the problem is. Not that stress is bad. We can work through the cycle of stress, but it's this chronic, overwhelming stress that a lot of us are facing that gets us locked in. And so then we start to see symptoms like anxiety, depression, insomnia, addictions, all of that can arise. So Gabor Mate, who is, he's a Canadian physician and an author, and he has an incredible background in researching stress. He writes that emotional stress is not just an emotional event. It's also a physiological event. That means that emotional stress affects our physiology in so many different ways. So if you wonder, or maybe you have or have not heard the stat that 75 to 90% of doctors' visits are on account of stress-related symptoms. It's a heck of a lot. There are a heck of a lot of stress-related symptoms. And the reason is because of the relationship between the mind and the body. And so these emotional experiences affect so many different levels: our immune system, hormones, nervous system, our heart, our gut. It affects us on so many different levels. And again, I don't say this to freak us out, make us feel like, oh no, I'm going to get sick right away because of all this stress. I'm saying this just to understand that while the pathways for, creating chronic issues are through our body, the pathways to healing that and to stabilizing are actually also through our bodies. And this is something that mindfulness teaches us. So I'll get into that. So I think, Nancy, you brought up perception in your discussion about how do different people come back differently, their levels of trauma were different in coming back from the war. Well, there's a great quote here that says, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So if we are in chronic dysregulation, everything looks dangerous and overwhelming. And anxiety shapes the way that we think and perceive. So when trauma gets lodged in the body, And we haven't found a way to work through that and extricate, literally, the stuckness of the trauma in our body. We may stay in chronic dysregulation. And so things continue to look dangerous. A sound might re-trigger us, right? We've learned a lot since the Vietnam War about how trauma gets stored in the body. But this is true about little t's, little traumas. COVID was a little trauma, at least. It could have been a big trauma for some of us. We've lost loved ones, right? But at the very least, COVID and how that changed society is one example of a little t, a little source of trauma that if we have not been able to work that through, it can really alter the way we perceive our sense of safety. So really important to understand that perception matters here. And again, going back to, we have to bring the unconscious into the conscious level and work with what's happening in our body rather than pushing these things away. So just to say here in this slide that, you know, our emotional dysregulation is our survival system trying to keep us safe. The reason why fight or flight reaction happens, why our body gets adrenalized when we're stressed out, is because in evolutionary times, we still need that, but, you know, we needed that to get away from the bear that was chasing us, right? Our bodies needed to have this adrenalized sympathetic distress response to be safe. And the freeze reaction is even older survival state that, you know, when an animal was threatened by another animal, they could just play dead. And perhaps that would save them from getting eaten because the other animal thought they were dead. Those freeze responses are still very much intact in our old reptilian brain because our brain evolved in different stages. And those stages didn't go away. We just evolved now. We have a very, you know, sophisticated thinking brain, but we still have our reptilian brain that tells us to freeze and immobilize to protect us. So all to say, these are natural reactions. They help to keep us safe, but they also overwhelm our system when we don't work with them. So how do we make our nervous system an ally? We really need to recognize that our nervous systems can either protect us through our fight or flight reaction, as I just described, or it can help us connect or co-regulate. That can help us increase our experience of safety. So what does that mean? That means we have to notice cues of danger. So if we're starting to get triggered in the body or even on the outside, we have to be aware and make sure we're noticing when we don't feel safe. But we also have to notice, is that sense of lack of safety because something's happening on the outside of us, or is it a reaction that's happening because of a history of trauma or just a history within us? And we can reduce our cues of danger by just bringing that awareness to our body. Like, what's actually happening in the moment? Am I really unsafe? Do I need to get out of this situation? Or is this a somatic, a physiological reaction? But we also need to be able to increase our experience of safety. And according to the trauma research, one really good way to do that is connecting with people. Co-regulation, it's called. Whether it's with other human beings that feel safe to us, are calm and grounded, it could be with animals. The best way to co-regulate is with a dog who's just calm and serene. In fact, I had to do blood work this morning, and I hate giving blood because it makes me super anxious, and I've had a history of fainting in the past. So I can get really like anxious and out of control with it. And so this morning I was deep breathing while the blood was being drawn, and I was co-regulating with an image of my dog Pillow, who does nothing but lick. Like, she's just a white fuzzy dog that licks. And that co-regulation just helped me so much. It really increased my experience of safety. And that is a perfect example of, you know, it was a minor threat on the outside. No, nobody likes giving blood, but I wasn't going to die from it, right? It was my own internal dynamic going on. So my choice was to deep breathe and to co-regulate with Pillow. And that is how I managed to bring kind of that steadiness back within and to get through that process. There are so many examples of how to do that in any moment-to-moment experience, but we have to be conscious and aware, okay, I'm starting to dysregulate, my nervous system is starting to, my sympathetic nervous system is starting to rev up. So how do I bring myself back to center? So these are some hints on some of the things that we can employ at any particular moment. So I've been mentioning this multiple times about regulation, that our nervous system and its fight, flight, freeze reaction happens beneath the level of our conscious awareness. So we have to consciously invite our brain to pay attention to our experience, to influence our nervous system. And that truly is the key here to making change, to emotional resilience, is paying attention to where we are in the moment, because only from that point can you do things that can be helpful to change the course of your nervous system. And that's really another, conscious awareness is another way of talking about mindfulness. Mindfulness is incredibly misunderstood in our culture as just meditation. Somehow that equation has stuck with many people, and they don't understand that mindfulness is not just meditation. Mindfulness is a much broader approach, and it is the awareness that we can bring in the moment when we pay attention on purpose. And Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, he also throws in non-judgmental. When we notice what's arising within us on purpose in the present moment, without judgment, meaning you're not going to judge yourself because you're having an anxiety attack, but you're going to notice it. Oh, here comes that anxiety. What is it that I might need to do to stabilize in this moment? Where can I bring resilience into this moment? And with this picture below, I'm pointing out here again that the body is the gateway to our present moment awareness, because let's use that anxiety attack example. You feel the anxiety rising in the body, and I know because I've experienced this many times, and you recognize, there's anxiety without judgment. Your choices are maybe well, first of all, stop what you're doing, right? Maybe sit down, maybe take a few deep diaphragmatic breaths, maybe notice what's happening. Right there, I can guarantee you're not going to be escalating your anxiety. Now, how skillfully you use those tools of stopping, deep breathing, checking in with your body can impact how quickly you decrease or de-escalate this stress. So conscious awareness, mindfulness, and this is also applicable to kids. We want to bring this back to kids. First of all, co-regulating with a child. If you can bring mindfulness into the moment and feel stable and regulated yourself, and you hug a child while you're actually doing some deep breathing, research shows this is an absolute guaranteed way to help co-regulate a dysregulated child. That is connection, but it has to be connection with a stable kind of energy, right? And so with a child who's dysregulated or anxious, having them ground in their feet, something like that, just bringing awareness into the body is a really powerful tool. Simple tool, but it brings them right into the present moment, not into all the things that are spinning off in their head. Bringing them right into their feet, feeling their feet connected to the floor, or having them take a few deep breaths. Very simple tools to help ground. But the key here is you have to be grounded too, as you're guiding a child through something. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a sec before I get into, actually, no, I'm going to go through this slide and the next one, and then I'll stop sharing and just check in. Because this slide really kind of lists the tools that I'm talking about. I mean, we could spend hours and weeks just talking about how to do these things. This is very cursory overview. I actually wrote a book that's coming out in October, and it has all of this in pure detail with practices and everything, if you are interested in really kind of settling into some of this. But just some suggestions about embodying safety, developing these inner resources, mindfulness, bringing awareness in the present moment with compassion. I could spend hours talking about the power of compassion, but if you just tell yourself, may I be well, and send yourself compassion in a moment where you're struggling, is extremely impactful. And when you can do those two things, moving along further, being able to develop a gratitude practice. There is so much research on the power of gratitude. And even if you're struggling and feeling like you're just down and having a hard time, getting yourself to even notice and name a few good things that have happened during the day, or things you're grateful for. My body works today, thank goodness. Or I get to go to sleep now, thank goodness. All of this is really impactful. So developing these inner resources, I refer to them as. And then the second piece of it is developing somatic and creative practices. So somatic are practices, body practices that work with the body, and creative practices that help us cycle through stress response and return to the experience of being present and in touch with ourselves and others. So this could be walking, somatic practices like just walking, like mindful walking, feeling connection with the earth. Some people like to dance or creative movement. Some people like to do art. Anything that kind of helps you connect with the body and brings you out of the mind are ways to help cycle through a stress response. And I'm sure you can imagine many examples of things you already do, or maybe examples of things that you used to do and stopped doing because you thought you were too busy. And guess what? It's really important to bring those back, and to even to schedule those things in, like scheduling a walk, or scheduling taking an art class, or scheduling trying to pick up a musical instrument. Really powerful. And then the third part of embodying safety is recognizing the impulse to isolate or disconnect from others. Because as I've mentioned before, co-regulation is such a powerful aspect of, emotional resilience. So connecting with empathetic and understanding people, that could be a therapist, it could be a friend, it could be someone who you just trust. Connecting with people who you don't trust or who will take up all the air and, launch into their problems, probably not the best strategy to embody safety. But just recognizing the value of asking for and accepting help and support from people who care about you, or people whose job it is to support you in these ways. And Rachel Naomi Remen, who's an author, wrote this, and I think this is powerful. She wrote, "The places we are seen and heard are holy places. They remind us of our value as human beings. They give us strength to go on. Eventually, they may even help us transform pain into wisdom." So there is so much to be gained from healthy connection. So we really talk about this in the mindfulness world as resourcing ourselves, and the psychotherapy world. All of these strategies are called resourcing, building up our resources. And I call it internal resourcing, because they're, again, not things that come from the outside. They're things that we have to practice. It's like building a muscle. It's like going to the gym. To make ourselves stronger, we have to practice resourcing by working on some of these strategies. And we have to create a safe space to resource. We have to access a grounded state. And this is where meditation comes in. So mindfulness, again, is the larger umbrella of how we bring awareness moment to moment. But we can get grounded if we can sit quietly and just notice our fingers, notice our feet, notice our breath. And just me talking about that, hopefully, kind of brings your sympathetic nervous system down a notch. Grounding in the moment, because the earth, the floor is here to support you. If you just notice the contact of your feet on the floor, you recognize, oh gosh, I don't have to work so hard. I can just let go into this moment, right? And really bringing acceptance and compassion to the moment. That is a whole other practice, because we tend to self-flog about how we're dealing with stress. I'm not handling this well. I'm not communicating well. I'm not doing my job well enough. But what if we started with acceptance? Like, I am where I am. It's okay, right? And may I be well in this painful, difficult, stressful moment. What if we started with that instead of started with the negativity and self-flogging? I hope you can see how powerful these simple shifts are that really can help you over time build emotional resilience, and you won't feel so wishy-washy and, kind of thrown off when something comes at you. Just a few books if you're interested in trauma, if you're interested in internal family systems. And then I am so self-promoting here, but I'm just pointing out this mindfulness book that's coming out in October, because it's really based on all the work that I'm trying to share and the work that I did in my Living Mindfully program through CSU Online. And then Callie Lindstadt, who's a regional health specialist in the Western region, put together a wonderful tool that just has some ideas and some mental health resources in there. And I just want to point out that she does Mindful Mondays for 30 minutes. There's a link to get into her Mindful Mondays. She does it for the Western region, but anybody in OEE is invited. So there are just so many resources I could share, but I will leave it at that.